Dr. Manuel Orozco has graced us with his presence at our convention for the last 4 years, and this is the 5th year, and we're very grateful. And there's a reason why we invite him back. He is, in my opinion, the most knowledgeable, innovative, and concentrated researcher and expert in the area of remittances. He is the Director of Remittances and Development and heads the Central America program at the Interamerican Dialogue, where he conducts policy analysis and advocacy on issues relating to global flows of remittances. In 2004 and 2005, this is old already, I'm sure you've done a lot since then. He directed a program funded by the MIF of the Inter-American Development Bank and International Fund for Agricultural Development of the UN to leverage remittance transfers. He continues to do exciting research in the field, and we're very lucky to have him. Dr. Manuel.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. And thank you for inviting me to talk to you about the remittance industry. I'm going to focus predominantly on this emerging topic of technologies, as is increasingly becoming more apparent that the role of technology in the money transfer industry is gaining more traction. In one way, we have been dealing with technology. The industry has, in fact, thrived because of technologies. In the very basic sense, the use of information system platforms, the use of hardware systems that are innovative, but also that speed the processing of money transfers has been relatively important in making and ensuring that the industry competes and provides good services. Now we are entering into a new stage, a stage that has been in the works for the past perhaps 7 to 10 years, where the issue of technology innovation has been increasingly taken into some consideration. Businesses that want to introduce alternative money transfer systems that are, in their view, cost-effective for the consumer. After 10 years of trial and error, there has been now a growing number of companies in the industry that are basically offering more technology-oriented systems. I want to basically discuss a couple of things with you on this issue. Perhaps the critical question will be, will these new technologies have an impact on the industry and particularly on the consumers? We see a series of trends taking place, all that together don't seem to show an outcome in the short term that may have implications in the future. The first issue is that there is definitely still a very competitive landscape, especially in the US to the rest of the world and Latin America in particular, whereby the majority of the money transfer operations are done by money transfer operators. Over 85% of transfers are conducted by these companies, and more importantly, the typical agent model and cash-to-cash transactions continues to prevail. But parallel to that, we see also a number of trends taking place next to that. One, for example, is that there is some relative strong consumer satisfaction. 70% of people who send money are satisfied with their money transfer business, but they are also increasingly expressing a shift, an interest to use alternative sending methods, not to change from their money transfer company, but to use a different alternative to cash. And this is something that has been going on. We've been tracking this since 2006, and this has consistently been that nearly 50% and sometimes more of immigrants want to switch to an alternative mechanism, but they are not switching. On the other hand, we see that there is some level of change in that the number of immigrants who are owning bank accounts in the United States is growing significantly. In 2003, for example, only 38% of Mexicans immigrants have bank accounts. Today, it's about 60%. It's been growing in almost all nationalities, and that has coincided with the interest to switch to alternative methods. Other trends that are taking place have to do that there is some traction in the remittance service provider segment that banks and internet-based money transfer companies are gaining market share. It's perhaps relatively small, less than 6% of the market, but it's been a consistent growth to some extent. And then there are other important issues that have to do with technologies. For example, the new regulations, the laws that were passed on the banking law that was passed in July of 2010 will require some aspects of disclosure and transparency on the side of money transfer companies that will need to introduce some form of technology. To some extent, there is some coalescence of trends taking place. There is still a preference, a current preference for the use of cash-to-cash transfers, yet people are wanting to move out of that system, and the industry is still connected to the cash-to-cash model, while people are going more or less in the direction of other alternatives. So the question is, will this have an implication over the industry in the short and the long term? So I want to take a look at a couple of things. First, if we look at the role of competition, we're definitely with a very competitive environment, at least in the US to the rest of the world, and the US to Latin America in particular. We're dealing with a relatively competitive context where you have significant number of money transfer companies competing among each other. Transaction costs for customers have been dropping, but they have dropped to a level where it's nearly difficult to reduce the cost anymore. We've been tracking the transaction cost for immigrants since 2000, and basically, even though there is a drop, the decline of the cost is less than 1/10 of 10% or less in relation to the previous year. So there is relatively little decline because the companies can go below the current costs. In addition to that, we find we've been scoring the performance of money transfer companies for several years, and we found this year, for example, that the most innovative, the most competitive companies in the industry were actually companies that come from particular different backgrounds. They are either in the internet-based system, or they are emerging companies, or they are banks. They're not necessarily the companies that have the largest market share in the business, nor are the ones that are the oldest companies in the business. But they are bringing some value-added component. And this is quite an interesting aspect, particularly because from the immigrant point of view, there are basically 4 issues that an immigrant looks into a money transfer. Cost is only one of them. Convenience, reputation, and value added of their services is another one. And so we see definitely some changes taking place that are quite distinctively different to the traditional competitive models. Other important characteristics that we see is that there is some level of consumer satisfaction on their product, but at the same time, there is a 30% of people who are not satisfied with their money transfer system. And the interesting aspect that the satisfaction is lower among the conventional, the more traditional money transfer money transfer operators. The level of satisfaction grows when you're using banks or internet-based money transfers. And we find that there is some sort of a correlation. There is no correlation, for example, between satisfaction and cost. There is a correlation between satisfaction and cost. The lower the cost, the higher the satisfaction among consumers. But because the cost basically has almost standardized across all companies about the $8 level, it's not becoming a matter of significance to the consumer. They are looking for other things different than cost when it comes to being satisfied with their providers. And again, while we see that, we see that immigrants consistently are saying that they want to switch to another transfer mechanism, and they find the use of alternative methods like bank transfers or the internet, for example, even mobile transfer. But basically, 47% of immigrants want to switch to a different sending mechanism. They don't want to switch from their company. Once an immigrant is loyal to that business, they don't move out of it. It is a myth that people shop around all the time. Actually, unless you have a significantly bad experience with your company, you are prepared to give them a second and sometimes a third chance. But they want a different method. And the question is, how do you go about the method, and why is it that they want a method? One of the reasons why is because on a typical immigrant, they have basically carry out about 6 financial activities. They they cash money, they send remittances, they have checking accounts and put money in savings. They also use money orders, among other things. Yet, on the locations, on the agent locations where they perform money transfers, they only do 2 of those 6 financial services, and they want to agglomerate more and more of their services in one place, in one institution. So they typically do money transfers and check cashing, or money transfers and money orders or bill payments, but they don't do all of them together. The answer as to why is because many of the agents don't provide most of these services. They either do 1 or 2 of those services. Yet immigrants are really wanting to switch to something that aggregates, that consolidates all the activities. Why is that the case? Because there is a learning curve. As people increasingly get into own bank accounts, they learn to use this facility for other things. They become more user-friendly with debit card, for example. And in fact, in some cases, immigrants are realizing that they can call their conventional money transfer company and request a deposit to make a transaction from their bank account to their relatives. That is, they can use the money transfer company to make account to cash transfers, but the majority of companies actually do not advertise that service, yet many of the companies offer it. And at the same time, we hear the whole discussion about technology, for example, internet, and the sexiness of mobile transfers. Everybody is saying, you know, mobile transfers, mobile phones are basically the thing to do business with. And look, it's working elsewhere, it's working in Africa, actually, or only works in one country, predominantly in Kenya. And there you have to look more carefully about what type of transactions are taking place, if they are airtime transactions as opposed to cash transactions, etc. But there is some traction going on with regards to technology. There is a growing trend in the supply side of cash transfers that is increasingly taking on the mobile transfer technology. But there is also other type of technologies. You know, in the United States, the emergence of different type of card services, for example, prepaid, reloadable, store value cards in general, became fashionable in the late 90s and early 2000s. You see that there was a fashion in the number of companies that started, but no traction. And even today, there is still a significant effort by these companies to really get to increase their revenues. Even the 2 largest providers are still seeking to grow in this segment. Immigrants, for example, we'll see later, do not necessarily are attracted to the prepaid card system or to store value cards in general. So, you know, is there a match? Is there a match between the supply side and the demand side?